and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share Wendigo stories I found on the internet. These encounters include two that involve screaming, with one using a man's voice like it was trying to lure a group into the forest, and another where the poster encountered a creature in a recurring nightmare that they later saw watching them in real life. This brings up several questions that I myself have and have brought up in past videos. But first, we start with a story about two young men who see something terrifying in a field behind their homes. The first story of this episode comes to us from Utah. He does not give an exact location. The original poster, or OP, believes he saw either a Wendigo or a skinwalker, so he posted his story online to see if anyone had ever seen anything like this before. He says he does not believe in cryptids and is very skeptical when it comes to the paranormal, even though he lives in an area where a lot of weird things have happened, including weird creature sightings, supposed hauntings, and UFO sightings. He says he does not live near Skinwalker Ranch, but he believes he lives in the path of the Skinwalker, as he refers to it. He was 17 years old at the time of his encounter. The house where he lived with his parents was part of a small town miles away from anywhere else. His backyard met an open field behind his house and mountains beyond that went on for miles. His best friend at the time lived next door, but his house was situated in a way that the field met both of their yards and acted as a backyard for both of their homes. His friend's house was actually on another street and in a cul-de-sac that was meant to have other homes built on it, but none ever were, leaving his friend's home as the only one in the cul-de-sac. He describes how their homes are situated because he says it becomes important later on in the story. He often stayed at his friend's house because he didn't have the best relationship with his parents. Every so often, they would wake up during the night to hear dragging and an odd gargling sound on the back porch. His friend's room was in the basement and the window well faced the porch, but when they would gather the courage to look outside, they would see nothing. This happened a few times a month and continued on for years. However, the events that transpired one night in particular still haunt them to this day. They sometimes stayed up all night playing video games or watching movies, but on the night of their encounter, they decided to go on a drive to listen to music and just vibe. This was when his friend's family was getting ready to move away. They headed out in his friend's truck, but as they turned out of the driveway, the vehicle's headlights panned across the field and they caught sight of this thing. It was humanoid in appearance, but definitely was not a person. It was abnormally large, completely naked, and on all fours. The creature's limbs stuck out to the OP due to the way they were seemingly folded up under this thing in a very unnatural way. It had pale skin that was stretched over its body. But what scared him the most was the creature's face. He describes the mouth as hanging open, revealing a gaping black maw that looked like a snake that had just unhinged its jaw like it was about to devour its prey. Its black eyes glistened in the headlights and were focused directly on the boys. Just briefly after it turned to see them, it hurried backward into the field's brush as if someone had hit rewind. All color drained from their faces. Clearly shaken, they turned to each other as if to say, "Did you see that too?" They went back inside and tried to enjoy the rest of their night or early morning, but were unable to after what they had just seen in the field. Instead, they sat in the basement holding firearms, waiting to hear the dragging and gargling on the back porch, but it never came. The OP no longer lives in that town, but he does visit on occasion. He still gets an eerie feeling from the field and feels like there is something out there watching and waiting. He hasn't seen anything else out there, but he can't help but feel like the creature he and his friends saw is still out there somewhere. When I read this story, I ruled out Skinwalker based on the description. This to me, especially with the way he described the mouth, seems like a Wendigo. I also think it could have been a crawler. but Wendigo are often described as having mouths similar to the creature he saw that night. As to whether what they saw was coming up on his friend's porch at night is anyone's guess, but I don't think it's a coincidence that they would hear strange things outside and then see this creature in the field behind his friend's house. Seems like it was the creature. What do you think this creature is? Wendigo, crawler, or something else? The next story also comes from Utah. The original poster lives in a small town near the Nevada border. The town is close to 3 canyons that are heavily forested, and the rest of the terrain is made up of desert with mountains surrounding his town and the outlying area. He posted his 2 experiences online in hopes that someone could tell him how to protect himself from a Wendigo. He believes what he is encountering in the area around his home is this particular type of cryptid, and it isn't just him either. His friend also had an encounter with a creature that they think was a Wendigo. This is what led to the OP thinking this is what was around his home, and that it's probably the same creature. All 3 encounters in this story take place in town, but on the edge near one of the canyon's entrances. His friend's encounter happened the same night the OP decided to turn to the internet for answers. He was walking home from the gym at around 11 p.m. when he came to an intersection. He looked up to see an abnormally lanky figure run down the opposite side of the road with inhuman speed. The thing was moving so fast that it was gone in the blink of an eye. He was spooked by what he saw but continued onward toward his home. He did so without incident until he reached his house. When he got to the fence in front of his house, he caught sight of something across the street. It was on all 4s and was massive. It was taller than him while standing on all 4s and was moving like how a human would if they tried to run in the same position. A very creepy feeling came over him then, and he rushed inside. The OP says his friend, who is usually lighthearted and jokes about almost anything, was clearly shaken up after the events, which is unlike him. The first of the OP's experiences took place not long before his friend's encounter, as he was walking home late at night near a large storm drain that runs down one of the canyons. He describes it as a huge concrete tunnel that a person could easily stand up in with room to spare. It goes on for about 20 meters before it feeds into the rest of the drainage system. However, the tunnel he was walking past extended to a reservoir near the top of the canyon. While he was walking near the entrance of the storm drain, he heard what sounded like a demonic scream come from within. He describes it as sounding like a deer, except it sounded digital, like a recording that was skipping. The scream freaked him out to the point that now every time he walks by the storm drain entrance, he grabs the handle of the knife he carries with him. His second encounter took place only a week before he made his post, and this one happened in his own backyard. He was outside with his dog at approximately 1 in the morning when he heard what sounded like a person whistle. The sound would repeat every 20 seconds. He is aware that it is unwise to return sounds when it may be related to cryptid activity, but his curiosity got the best of him. He whistled back and everything got quiet, but only for a moment before it continued. Except now it sounded like it was farther away. The whistle was not melodic in nature, just a single tone that would repeat itself like clockwork every 20 or so seconds. The OP says he isn't spooked easily and normally finds creepy experiences like this kind of cool, but he has done enough research to know not to mess around with cryptids or anything paranormal. He goes on to say that there are things in this world that are a real danger to us, and he isn't really sure how we would even begin to defend ourselves against something like that. Unfortunately, the same roads he had his experiences on are the same ones he is forced to walk to work on at 4 in the morning. He later says in a comment that avoiding going down these roads at that time or in the dark are unavoidable. He does, however, carry a knife on him when walking, but does not feel that that would be enough to defend against a cryptid or anything similar. He asks at the end of his post if there is any way of defending himself against what he and his friend believe to be a Wendigo or anything else that goes bump in the night. I believe this could be a Wendigo or a crawler, but the way he describes the screaming and the whistling being repeated as if they were recordings on repeat makes me think this could be a skinwalker, as this is mostly attributed to them. Wendigo do mimic voices and sounds, but I've only heard them sounding like recordings being played on repeat in skinwalker stories. And he definitely lives in an area where skinwalker activity is high. I could be wrong though, and this could very well be a Wendigo. Either way, he is dealing with a mimic and should avoid engaging it at all cost. Usually, if you ignore them, they move on, as if losing interest. I, however, wouldn't take it lightly and definitely keep an eye on my surroundings while walking down these dark roads. What do you think he is encountering? And what would be the best way to deal with it or defend himself against something like this should he cross paths with it? The next story comes from a poster who details how she and her friends heard a man's voice yelling in the woods. But there was no one else around at the time, and what followed terrified them. She does not say where she lives exactly, just that she lives in the Great Plains. The original poster was on a hike with her sister and their 3 friends. Their chosen trail, which was 9 miles long, would take them through a heavily forested area. After walking about a quarter of the way down the trail, they came to a bend with a bench where people could sit and watch the river. They stopped to take a break at the spot and noticed that the sun had begun to set. When they continued their hike, they came to an area with a clearing. The grass on either side of the trail was about 4 feet tall, with a tree line about 100 feet off the trail just beyond the clearing. The group got no more than 50 feet into the clearing before they started hearing a man screaming in the woods. Everyone froze where they stood and looked at each other, trying to figure out what the man was saying. That's when they heard the man scream again, and this time it was very clear what he was yelling. "Help! Help me! Help!" They could not tell where the voice was coming from, who could be out there yelling, or if it was even a man at all. Silence lingered for a few seconds before her friend yelled back, "Hello? Do you need help?" No response. They stand there frozen in place trying to figure out what they should do. They also tried to figure out if it was actually someone calling out for help or if it was something else entirely. After standing there engulfed in silence for a few minutes, they finally decided to keep going. They didn't hear any more screaming, but they did hear heavy footsteps following along near them, coming from the forest. On their way out of the woods, they thought they saw eyes in the trees, but the OP says later in a comment that they couldn't tell for sure if they were eyes and chalked it up to reflections or light anomalies. When they reached the end of the trail, they once again heard the same man's voice screaming from within the forest, but what was being yelled was indiscernible. They left with no further incidents and have not been back down that trail since. About a week later, the OP was sitting outside at about 3 or 4 in the morning when she heard the same scream she and her friends heard on the trail that day. It was the same man's voice, once again calling out for help. Her friend came outside and asked if the OP heard it too. The man in the woods yelled for help again and again. Her other friends had come out by that point and they stood listening until they heard footsteps heading toward them. They immediately went back inside and locked all the doors. They didn't talk about it for fear of attracting whatever was out there and thus bringing it closer to the house. They all believe what they encountered out there was a Wendigo, especially since there have been a lot of sightings in the area where she lives. They also thought it could have been a skinwalker, but dismissed this because they didn't see any animals. They live in a college town and think the perceived Wendigo heard a student's voice and replicated it in an attempt to try and lure them into the woods. But they ignored the voice and did not investigate further. The whole group was worried it could have been a man who needed help, so they kept an eye on the news the following week, thinking they might see a report of someone who had gone missing, had an accident, or anything related to what they heard. But there was nothing. One commenter asked why they didn't contact authorities right away, but the OP says the cries for help came from the areas where they had just walked and they had not seen anyone else out there that day. She mentioned again that they kept an eye on the news and that the trail is a popular hiking spot, so if something had happened out there, someone would have seen or heard something. Also, park rangers regularly patrol the area and no reports of missing persons or incidents ever came out. This to me, especially since she heard the exact same voice a second time more than a week later, sounds like a cryptid of some sort mimicking a man's voice and calling out for help to try and lure them into the forest. And one cryptid that is known to do this is a Wendigo. Now there are other types of cryptids who can mimic voices too. Skinwalkers, Sasquatch, and I've heard people say crawlers can do it too. Although I've never heard any stories where they do. Not to say they can't. Who knows what these creatures are capable of? But the heavy footsteps they heard in the forest made me think Wendigo. What do you think was trying to lure them into the woods? The final story of this episode is a little different. It isn't just a sighting or an encounter. Instead, it seems to be the stalking of someone both in their dreams and in real life. In my last Wendigo video, I asked the question, can Wendigo invade our dreams? Well, I found yet another story where the original poster has dreams about a Wendigo before seeing it in real life. This again raises the question, can Wendigo, or any other cryptid for that matter, affect and alter our dreams? There is also another question I talk about often, and that is whether these beings are natural physical beings or supernatural creatures. I have said and will continue to say I believe they are both. They seem to be able to affect our senses and mess with our heads, as I've documented in stories I've done and from what I've heard in other stories. But they are also physical beings made of skin, blood, and bone, as there are stories documenting how they have been killed on rare occasions. Not to mention they kill to eat, meaning they require sustenance. And then there are the stories where they touch and attack people. The more you delve into this topic, the more intriguing and mysterious it gets. Sorry for the long introduction to this story. There are just some questions that come to mind when I come across stories like this next one. The OP put his story online because he was seeking answers and/or advice. He lives in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and is fascinated by cryptids and loves the stories and everything else that comes along with them. He notes that he and his friends often ride around on old trails searching for the scary and unknown. He does admit that this isn't the smartest of ideas. Well, be careful what you wish for. About a month before he posted his story, he started having strange dreams. In the dream, he is standing in a moonlit field. Across the field, he can clearly see a tall, humanoid creature with grayish-black skin, a distorted face, and large claws standing there watching him. He and the creature stand there just looking at each other before he eventually wakes up. When he does wake up, there is a lingering, rotting smell. He lives in an old house and just chalks it up to that, even though he also smells it when he stays at his friend's house. The dreams persisted for about a month before things turned very real. The night he posted his story, he was over at his friend's house. A storm moved through the area before he left to go home, which scattered branches across the roads. While driving, he was forced to slow down and stop to navigate the branches. It was while he was trying to drive around one that he looked out his window and he saw it, the creature from his dream, standing there watching him. He closes his post stating he wanted to share his stories to see if anyone had encountered something similar because he was unsure what to do next. A lot of commenters gave him the advice to stand up to this creature in the dream and in real life and let it know that it was not welcome in his life. Someone else mentioned that he could have inadvertently invited this thing into his life by seeking things like this out. I think this could be true. Something has definitely attached itself to the OP, and he very well could have attracted it by going out searching for cryptids and other scary things. I also think standing up to it could work, but you have to do so with authority and absolutely mean what you say when you tell it to leave you alone. What do you think this creature is? And what do you make of cryptids being able to affect our dreams? Do you think he was given sound advice? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.